I don't talk about this much. Not because it's a secret, because once I start, it doesn't stop properly. We bury my uncle. I say uncle because that's easier than explaining what he was to me. He was the person who showed up when my father didn't. The one who called without a reason. The one who knew when something was wrong before you said it. The day they told us he was gone, everything moved too fast. Hospital. Papers. Words I didn't understand, but nodded it anyway. People kept saying, at least it was quick. I didn't know what that meant. Quick for who? At the burial, I stood at the back. I remember thinking the coffin looked smaller than it should have, like something had been taken out. My mother cried in a way I had never heard before. Not loud, just empty. When it was over, everyone went home and acted like grief had a schedule. Eat, sleep, move on. That night, his phone rang. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because my body didn't know what else to do. I watched it ring until it stopped. The next day, it rang again. I answered without thinking. I didn't say hello. There was silence for a moment, then breathing, then my name. I hung up and sat there for a long time. I told myself it was a mistake. Someone else. Anything but what it sounded like. Because if it was him, then we had buried someone alive. And that thought doesn't let you breathe properly. At the hospital, I asked questions I didn't want answers to. They avoided me in small ways. Changed shifts. Said things like, that's not uncommon. Nothing felt solid anymore. At home, his shoes were still where he left them. I tripped over them once and got angry. Then felt stupid for being angry at shoes. A week later, my cousin asked me why his dad's phone kept calling. I didn't know what to say. The call stopped after a while. That's what hurts the most. Not knowing if he stopped calling because he was found or because he gave up. People say things like, everything happens for a reason. I don't believe that. I believe sometimes people trust systems too much. Doctors, paperwork, closure, and sometimes someone who is still breathing gets left behind. We didn't kill him, but we buried him, and that's a weight you don't put down. Even now, when my phone rings from a number I don't know, my chest tightens, because part of me is still waiting for someone we already said goodbye to. No one said we should move them. No one said we shouldn't. That night, the house didn't feel empty. It felt paused. Around midnight, his phone rang. It was lying on the table where we had dropped it earlier. Face up. The sound wasn't loud, just enough. No one reacted immediately. It rang until it stopped. My sister laughed once. A short, broken sound, then covered her mouth like she'd said something unforgivable. The next day, it rang again. I answered it before anyone could stop me. I didn't say hello. There was breathing. I waited for a voice to explain itself. Instead, I heard my name. Not loud, not weak, normal. I ended the call and stared at the wall. I didn't tell anyone what I heard. I said it was a wrong number. That lie stayed with me longer than I expected. Over the next few days, things stopped lining up properly. The ring they returned wasn't the one he wore every day. They said it must have been misplaced. The shoes in the coffin weren't his size. The undertaker said families often misremember. At the hospital, a nurse avoided my questions by answering different ones. I told myself grief makes you suspicious. That pain looks for patterns. But the calls kept coming. Not every day, just enough to keep me awake. Sometimes I let it ring. Sometimes I answered and said nothing. The breathing was always there. One night I whispered, "Where are you?" The call ended. That was when I realized something that still makes my chest tighten when I think about it. If he was alive, then we hadn't just lost him. We had left him. I started going back to the hospital alone, asking questions I didn't want answers to. They spoke in careful sentences, legal ones. One doctor told me, "These things happen." I asked him what things. He didn't answer. At home, my mother stopped going into his room. She said the air felt wrong. My nephew asked why his dad hadn't come home yet. No one corrected him. The call stopped suddenly. That was worse than when they were happening, because now there was no proof either way. Just silence. Weeks passed, then months. People stopped asking how we were coping. Life learned how to walk around the space he left. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I imagine him somewhere unfamiliar, trying to explain who he is, trying to remember our phone numbers. And I wonder if he stopped calling because someone told him we already buried him. We didn't kill him, but we trusted people who told us to stop looking. And some nights, that feels like the same thing. I didn't tell anyone about the last call, the one where I whispered back. I think part of me was afraid that if I said it out loud, someone would make it stop. And as long as it didn't stop, there was still a chance I hadn't failed him completely. Days went by where nothing happened. Those were the hardest, because silence lets your mind do whatever it wants. I replayed the funeral over and over. Not the prayers, not the speeches, small things. The way the coffin lid looked too smooth. The way the man from the hospital wouldn't answer when I asked how long the body had been there before we arrived. The way my mother hesitated before she nodded yes. I kept thinking about that nod. Sometimes I'd sit in his room and try to remember his voice properly. Not how he sounded on the phone, how he sounded when he laughed, when he was annoyed, when he said my name like it mattered. I was scared I'd forget, and that scared me more than anything else. One afternoon, I went back to the hospital again. No reason this time, just walking. The receptionist looked at me and said, "You again," without meaning to, then apologized. I asked to see the file. She said it wasn't possible. I asked anyway. She leaned closer and lowered her voice like we were sharing a secret. She said, "Sometimes families accept what they're given." I asked her what she meant. She said, "I shouldn't have said that." That sentence stayed with me. At home, my mother started doing strange things. Not dramatic things. Quiet ones. She washed his clothes, even though they were already clean. She moved his mug from one shelf to another and back again. She asked if anyone had checked the gate at night. I asked her why. She said, "Just asking." I wanted to tell her about the calls. Every time I opened my mouth, I imagined the look on her face if I was wrong. So I stayed quiet. One night, I dreamt he was standing at the door. Not knocking, just standing there like he didn't want to wake anyone. My hand shook so badly I had to sit down. No note. No explanation, just the watch. I showed it to my sister. She stared at it for a long time and said, "That's impossible." Then she handed it back to me like it burned. That night, the phone rang again. I answered. This time he spoke more. Not much, just enough. He asked if we were okay. That's what broke me. I asked him where he was. He said he didn't know how to explain it. I asked him if he knew about the funeral. There was a pause. Then he said, "I thought I was dreaming." I sat on the floor and pressed my forehead into my knees. I didn't cry. I felt hollow. I told him we thought he was dead. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice sounded tired. He said, "They told me no one came back for me." I don't remember what I said after that. I remember the call ended on its own. After that, everything became complicated. Because knowing someone is alive doesn't mean you can get to them. There were rules, jurisdictions, errors that no one wanted to admit to. Every office sent me to another office. Every call ended with, "We'll look into it." No one ever called back. Officially, he was deceased. That meant his identity was closed. His accounts, his records. I learned something during that time. Systems don't like being wrong. They prefer silence to correction. Weeks turned into months. The calls became shorter. Sometimes he sounded clearer. Sometimes he sounded far away. Once, I heard other voices in the background. Men. I asked him if he was safe. He said, "I don't think I'm where I'm supposed to be." That was all. After that, the calls stopped again. This time for longer. I didn't sleep properly. Every unknown number made my heart race. Every quiet night felt like a warning. My mother asked me one evening if I believed he was really gone. I looked at her and almost told her everything. Instead, I said, "I don't know." She nodded like she already knew the answer. She said, "If he's alive, he must be so angry with us." I didn't correct her, because anger would have been easier. Sometimes I imagine him trying to come back. Being told his name doesn't exist anymore. Being shown a paper that says he's already been buried. I wonder if he ever stood somewhere familiar and decided it was better not to be seen. Because how do you return to a place that already mourned you? How do you knock on a door when your family already learned how to live without opening it? People ask why we never went public, why we didn't shout. They don't understand. Once the world agrees you're dead, it gets uncomfortable when you say otherwise. And once a family accepts it, admitting the mistake feels like betrayal. We made a choice without saying it out loud. We stopped pushing. I still don't know when that happened. I just know that one day I realized I hadn't tried in weeks. That realization sits in my chest like something unfinished. Sometimes I think the hardest part isn't that we buried the wrong man. It's that, when we realized it, we didn't dig him back out. I didn't tell anyone about the watch at first. Not because I was protecting them, because once you introduce proof, people start expecting outcomes. And I didn't have any. I kept it in the pocket of my jacket. Even when I wasn't wearing the jacket, I knew exactly where it was. Like my body had memorized the weight. A few weeks after that, the bank called. They didn't say his name at first. They asked if I was the next of kin. I said yes. They said there had been a problem. I went down there thinking it was paperwork. Another loose end. The woman at the desk spoke carefully, the way people do when they don't want to be recorded in your memory. She said there had been activity on an account that should have been frozen. I asked what kind of activity. She said withdrawals. Not many. Not large. Just enough to mean intent. I told her there must be a mistake. She turned the screen slightly toward me. Dates. Times. All after the funeral. I felt something shift in my chest. Not relief. Not fear. Something heavier. I asked where the withdrawals were made. She said different locations. None close to home. I told her again that he was dead. She nodded, but her eyes didn't. She said, "We'll need to investigate." That word stayed with me all the way home. Investigate. As if he were a problem. At home, my sister was arguing with a lawyer on the phone. Not shouting. Tight, controlled sentences. She hung up and told me there was an issue with the will. Apparently, he'd updated it recently. Recently didn't make sense. Recently meant after. She said the lawyer wanted to confirm something. I asked what. She said that he's actually dead. That was the first time a sentence was said out loud in our house. Not as a fear, as a requirement. I felt sick, because somewhere along the way, the question had stopped being, is he alive, and become, what do we do if he is? The lawyer wanted proof. The hospital had paperwork. The burial had witnesses. On paper, everything was perfect. Reality was the problem. I started getting calls from numbers I didn't recognize again. Not him. Other people. Offices. Departments. Everyone asking questions no one wanted answered. One man asked if I had reason to believe my uncle might still be alive. I said I didn't know. He said, "We need clearer than that." I told him the truth. I said, "I think we buried the wrong person." There was a pause. Then he said, "That's a serious statement." I said, "So, is burying someone who's breathing?" The line went quiet. After that call, things changed. Not dramatically. Subtly. Files were misplaced. Appointments were delayed. People stopped returning messages. It felt like pushing against something soft that refused to move. One evening, my mother asked why people kept calling the house. I told her it was about accounts. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "If he's alive, I don't think I can survive knowing we left him." That sentence ended the conversation. I realized then that this wasn't just about finding him anymore. It was about what it would do to the people who loved him if we did. The next lead came from someone I didn't expect. An old friend of his. Someone he hadn't spoken to in years. He said my uncle had reached out once. Just once. Asked for help. Didn't explain much. Just said he couldn't come home yet. I asked why he didn't tell us sooner. He said he asked me not to. That hurt more than anything else. Because it meant my uncle had made a choice. Not to disappear completely, but to limit the damage. I asked where he was now. The man shook his head. Said he didn't know. Said the call ended abruptly. Said when he tried calling back, the number no longer worked. I walked home that night instead of taking a bus. I needed the time. I kept thinking about choice. About how we imagine being alive means being free. But sometimes it just means choosing which pain you can live with. I started to wonder if he stayed away on purpose. Not because he couldn't return, but because returning would mean facing what had been done in his name. The funeral, the speeches, the acceptance. How do you walk back into a life that already learned how to mourn you? The bank froze the account again. The lawyer postponed everything indefinitely. The system settled back into comfort. I didn't, because now I knew something I couldn't unknow. He had been alive long enough to make decisions, to move, to choose distance. That meant this wasn't just an error. It was a fracture, and fractures don't heal cleanly. I still don't know if he's alive today, but I know this. At some point, it stopped being about saving him. It became about whether we were willing to tear apart the life we rebuilt just to prove the truth. And when that moment came, we hesitated. Not long, but long enough. All right, we moved forward. No backtracking, no reteaching grief. This is where things cost something. I didn't tell my mother about the bank. I told myself it was temporary, that once things were clarified, I'd explain everything at once, cleanly, like there was a clean version of this story. But clarity never came. Instead, there were consequences. The house. That was the first real fight. Not loud, not dramatic. My sister said it made sense to sell. Too many memories. Too much space. She said it like she'd practiced. I asked her where he would go if he came back. She didn't answer immediately. Then she said, "If he comes back, we'll figure it out." That sentence told me everything. People say things when they've already decided. The sale moved fast. Too fast. Buyers don't care about ghosts. They care about square footage. On the day the sign went up, I stood across the street and watched strangers walk through his rooms. Rooms where his voice used to live. That night, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered without thinking. It wasn't him. It was a woman. She asked if I knew a man by his name. I said yes. She hesitated before continuing. She said he'd been brought into a clinic months ago. Confused. Malnourished. He had insisted he already had a family. Insisted we'd come for him. She said they'd discharge him after a while because there was no record of him. No ID that matched an active profile. No next of kin that officially existed. I asked where this clinic was. She said she couldn't tell me. I asked why she was calling now. She paused. Then she said, "Because he stopped asking for you." I sat down on the floor. She said she'd found my number in an old contact list he carried around. Folded paper. Names written by hand. She said mine was circled. I asked if he was alive. She didn't answer directly. She said, "He was when I last saw him." After the call ended, I didn't move for a long time. Not because I was overwhelmed. Because something had settled. A heavy, unmistakable understanding. He hadn't been waiting anymore. He'd been adjusting. The sale of the house closed the following week. My mother stood in the doorway one last time and said nothing. She didn't cry. She just touched the door frame like she was memorizing it. That night, she asked me a question she'd never asked before. She said, "If he came back tomorrow, would you tell him the truth?" I asked what she meant. She said, "Would you tell him we stopped looking?" I didn't answer. She nodded. That was worse than anger. After that, things sped up. Accounts finalized. Documents archived. His name became something people spoke in the past tense without checking our faces. I started dreaming less. Not because things were better. Because my mind had stopped offering comfort. One evening, months later, I saw him again. I know how that sounds. I was walking through a crowded terminal. Late. Tired. I saw his profile in passing. Older. Thinner. But unmistakable. I stopped. Turned. He was standing near a pillar, holding a small bag. Looking around like someone reading signs they didn't understand. I took one step toward him, then another, and then something inside me hesitated. Not fear. Recognition. If I called his name, everything would change. For him. For us. There would be questions. Anger. Paperwork. Shame. He would learn we buried someone else in his place. He would learn we sold his house. He would learn we mourned him publicly, then reorganized our lives privately. He looked tired, not lost, adjusted, like someone who had learned how to live without expecting rescue. I stopped walking. He turned slightly, like he felt something. I don't know if he saw me. I don't know if he recognized me. The crowd moved, and then he was gone. I stood there longer than I should have. People brushed past me. No one noticed. I went home and didn't tell anyone. Not my sister. Not my mother. Because some truths don't heal. They just rearrange the pain. I still don't know if that was him. I don't know if I missed my chance. Why do know is this? We didn't lose him once. We lost him in stages. First to a mistake, then to fear, then to comfort. The funeral was real. The prayers were real. The grief was real. But the man we buried wasn't. And somewhere out, there is a person who learned how to survive being erased. And a family who learned how to live with that erasure. Not proudly, just quietly. That's how most things end. Not with answers, but with the weight of the choices you didn't think were choices at the time. I carry that weight every day, and I don't tell this story because I want forgiveness. I tell it because pretending it didn't happen felt worse. After that day, at the terminal, I stopped looking for him in crowds. Not because I stopped believing, but because belief had already taken too much from me. I went back to ordinary things. Work, bills, Small conversations that didn't require explanations. People think moving on looks like strength. Most times it's just fatigue. My mother aged quickly after we sold the house. Not physically at first. In posture. She stopped correcting people when they spoke about him in the past tense. She stopped lighting the small candles she used to light every evening. One day, I asked her why. She said, "If he's alive, I don't want him to feel like we replaced him." That sentence sat between us for a long time. We never spoke about it again. Years passed, not in a dramatic way, in a quiet one. Birthdays came and went without his name being mentioned. Holidays adjusted themselves around the absence. At some point, I realized something unsettling. If he'd come back now, I wouldn't recognize the person he'd become. And worse, he wouldn't recognize us either. Because families don't just wait. They adapt. They build routines that don't leave space for interruptions. I sometimes imagine him hearing about us from a distance, learning that life continued, that we laughed again, that we survived. And I wonder if that hurt more than being forgotten. There was one final call. Years later, unknown number. I stared at it until it stopped ringing. I didn't call back. Not because I was afraid. Because I knew something then that I didn't know before. Some endings don't arrive with clarity. They arrive with responsibility. Answering would have meant reopening everything. For him. For us. And I wasn't sure who that would save. So I let it ring. That's the part people don't like when they hear this story. They want courage. They want reunion. They want something that feels earned. But real life doesn't ask what kind of ending you want. It asks what you can live with. We didn't kill him. We didn't plan to lose him. But we trusted a system because it gave us permission to stop hurting. And when the truth started knocking quietly, we didn't always open the door. The funeral was real. The tears were real. The earth closing over that coffin was real. But the man inside it wasn't. Somewhere, someone is alive with a past that no longer fits him. And somewhere else, a family learned how to grieve a living person without saying it out loud. That's the part that stays with me. Not the mistake. The acceptance. Because once you accept something long enough, it becomes true in every way that matters. And that's how this ends. Not with certainty, but with the knowledge that some people don't disappear. They're just slowly agreed out of existence. And we live with that agreement. Every day.